1976's Massacre at Central High is a drama thriller with some quite neat proto-slasher elements thrown into the mix that, to 21st century sensibilities, is a bit of a problematic movie. This is because a core element of the plot revolves around a disillusioned student going on a murderous rampage culminating in several bomb attacks on students and a final bomb attack on a school. This film wouldn't really be made today, and with good reason. Realistically, at the time this was produced, school massacres were seen as a terrible, awful thing, but they were also seen as the kind of incident that could never really happen to me, in terms of society's opinions on them. So, with that in mind, Massacre at Central High follows the story of David, Mark and Teresa. David is a transfer student who's arrived at the school after an undisclosed incident meant he had to transfer. Upon arriving at the high school, he notices that life's rather odd. Students tend to move in huddled groups, they don't talk to each other, and they try to get to their classes as soon as possible. After doing some snooping around, it's revealed that a group of bullies have basically taken over the school. They attack any students they feel like, they pick on the outcasts, they destroy property, carry weapons, and probably the most abhorrent of all, they're basically full-blown rapists. They have free run of the school grounds and pretty much do whatever they like, whenever they like, with little to no consequence. And David's friend Mark is a part of that group. It turns out that Mark went to the same school as David did, and David saved Mark from being bullied at the school before he was transferred. But on landing at Central High, Mark began to get chummy with the bullies, fully aware that David couldn't save him this time. And the bullies let him into their circle. David is horrified to see what's become of Mark, but David offers to cut Mark into the bullies' luxury lifestyle as long as he plays ball, something David actively refuses to do. While tensions continue to grow between David, Mark and the bullies, we're then also introduced to Teresa, Mark's girlfriend, who really takes a shine to David. Basically, she wants to screw him. That's not exaggeration either, she admits as much to Mark at one point, and that only further drives the tension between David and Mark higher. Disillusioned with Mark and growing increasingly tired of the bullies, David decides to try to get to know the outcasts of the school a bit better. The nerds, the wimps, the weaklings and the stoners who the bullies regularly use for target practice. And it's here that David learns just how deep the corruption runs, and it's not long after that we reach a breaking point. When the bullies, sans Mark, decide they want to get some, they effectively kidnap two girls after school, take them to an empty classroom with the express intention of running train on them. Teresa sees this happen and tries to make the bullies feel guilty by announcing that she's just going to sit and watch them do it. But because she's Mark's girlfriend, she gets thrown out into the corridor, where David sees her. David storms in, beats the crap out of all the bullies before rescuing the girls and heading out for a run. Some time passes and the bullies decide to exact their revenge. They find out that David has gone to one of the weedy kids' house to help him fix his car after the bullies trashed it, and the bullies... well, they drop a car on David, destroying his legs. David was a keen athlete, so this would be a bit like blinding an author or deafening a musician. It's life-changing. David's sent to the hospital where he refuses to see anyone, and after a prolonged period of time, he reappears walking with a cane and being way too mild-mannered for my liking. This is because David's decided the only way to sort this problem out is to get rid of the bullies once and for all. And so one by one, David kills each of the bullies in a relatively spectacular way. Only stopping short of killing Mark for two reasons. One, because David has the hots for Teresa and doesn't want to upset her by killing her boyfriend. And two, because he believes that Mark's punishment of knowing all of his friends have been killed and he's now in the minority at a high school that hate him, where he has no defence from the regular onslaught of the student body, is going to be torturous enough in and of itself. And for a time, life settles down at Central High. The students begin to populate the grounds again, to have fun in the halls and to take their time to chat and enjoy life. But things start to slowly sour as the outcasts, now liberated from their oppressors, slowly begin to develop visions of grandeur. You see, The outcasts begin to factionalize, and each faction believes that David is on their side. They all start to bully rival factions, and each side tries to convince David that siding with them would offer a really sweet and cushy ride. They essentially all turn into the bullies they once feared, and David sees this from a mile off. So he does what any good student would do, and he walks away. I'm just kidding, he bombs the shit out of all of them. While this is going on, Teresa and Mark quickly fall down the pecking order and effectively become social pariahs. They're bullied by everyone, regularly attacked, and struggle by day. While their relationship is reinforced by the abuse, the pair begin to wonder what David will do next. And when the bombings start happening, they slowly begin to piece together that David may have finally gone too far. It's here that David reveals his final plan to sort out the school once and for all, leading to a climactic final act in which Mark and Teresa must race against time to stop David's plot from succeeding and to ultimately avoid a massacre at Central High. The script for this one is problematic in more ways than one. Aside from the aforementioned school shooting aspect, the thing that I really get hung up on with this film is just how much of a Mary Sue David is, and how much the writers of this script really go out of their way to try and make you feel sympathy towards him when he genuinely deserves none of it. A Mary Sue, to those unfamiliar with the term, is a character in fiction, inserted by the author, who is in effect untouchable. They're perfect in practically every way, can do no wrong, and on occasion will have a single glaring flaw that's supposed to be a surface level attempt at adding depth to the character. And David is very much the Mary Sue of this film. He's near perfect. He's a top-of-the-class athlete, he reads to an advanced level, all the students love him, all the women want him, and the bullies really like him up until the point that the film indicates they need to not like him. The script goes to painful lengths to try and justify David's actions throughout, making out that the death of the bullies is some kind of great happening that only got spoiled by the outcasts turning nasty. And even though David experiences 1 or 2 moments of grief, the broken legs and the fact that even though Teresa wants to have sex with him, she can't, oh what a sad position to be in, poor Teresa, they never even begin to try and make out that David may in fact be a weirdo incel cunt who's very clearly in the wrong and needs to be locked up somewhere. It's infuriating to me that this film goes down this route so blindly, because in the wrong hands, this film could basically be recruitment propaganda for a high school shooting coming soon to a county near you. And even though the ending offers David a redemption lifeline, it doesn't do nearly enough to convince me that this film's framings are way out of whack and super unacceptable. In terms of pacing, it's alright. Honestly, the film starts a bit dull but picks up around the second act when the bullies drop a car on David, and after that the revenge, thriller, proto-slasher elements start to come into play and the film actually has something to do or say. Even if it's talking shit in terms of themes and messages, it projects that shit at a reasonable rate, with decent pacing that kept my attention right the way through to the credits without clock watching. The dialogue isn't the best I've ever heard, but it's more than reasonable in what it's trying to achieve. There weren't any lines that I thought were drastically poor, but there were scenes I would have probably shortened or removed, if only because it's largely reaffirming existing information we already knew, or literally stating the bleeding obvious. A recurring theme you'll hear me mention across all the aspects of this picture is that it feels like a TV movie to me, and that's exactly what this script feels like. It feels like an extended cut TV movie that's had some nudity and stronger swears put back in for the home video release. I think that description's probably about as best I can tell you in terms of what you're getting into here. This piece of incel alt-right pro-murder fanfiction was written and directed by Rennie Daldere, who died on New Year's Eve 2019. They say you can't slander the dead. He has 14 writing credits and 11 directing credits. He mainly wrote what he directed, and his filmography predominantly consists of documentaries and sci-fi horror thrillers. While what he's written here isn't objectively bad, it's the themes and messages that I really cannot abide. The man was clearly a relatively talented writer of exploitation cinema, which is why I find it such a shame that he chose to play this film the way he did. For my gripes about the script, the direction by contrast is pretty decent, if and only if you consider what this film appears to be setting out to achieve. In terms of how it works with its sets and locations, it does a pretty decent job. There are some gorgeous locations used throughout the film. I think while it would have been nicer to see a few more dusk and evening pieces worked into this, purely for how well these times of day are handled within the film, I think Rennie presents a strong visual style here that I really quite enjoyed. The direction of the cast too is more than decent. There are some genuinely lovely moments, and while the cast and performances in and of themselves are a bit uneven, the way Rennie uses them within the locations and how he's directed the delivery of the lines is pretty solid. Does this film go above and beyond? Absolutely not, and again, the comparisons to TV movies are all but inescapable to me. I really can't shake that this was an ABC movie of the week or something. It just lacks that final layer of sheen that'd make it look more professional. But on the whole, I'd definitely put it in the upper half of the exploitation genre in terms of quality of direction and output. That isn't really much of an honour given how low the barrel goes for this genre, but hey, it's something. The Cine, well, it's a bit safe. And whereas I'd usually prefer safe over experimentation that fails, here I think it could have afforded to go a bit more all out. Shot setups here feel like they're going through the motions, and there was nothing on display that made me jump up and say, wow. It does the job, but I kinda wish it had pushed a bit further in involving the audience in the action. That's not to say it's a totally bland experience. There are some very nicely framed pieces scattered here and there, but even they end up hindering at times due to some very ham-fisted editing in places. This is one of those films where the practical effects shots were shot at a completely different day, time, weather and location to the shots cut around it. So quite frequently you'll see really nice Cine get hard cut awkwardly to shots set up for practicality's sake above anything else for the stunts and explosions, which kind of ruins the mood. I know an editor can ultimately only work with what materials they have, but here there are just too many moments of poor editing for me to let something like that slide by unchallenged. Performance-wise, we find an uneven playing field. Daryl Morey and Andrew Stevens are both pretty solid as David and Mark respectively. The pair have a good chemistry, and you could really believe that the pair were friends who, because of the paths they went down, fell out. They both have pretty natural deliveries and give relatively great performances. I'd argue they were the best of this film. Kimberly Beck is arguably the weakest element in this as Teresa. She's not unwatchable, but her delivery leaves a bit to be desired. And there are some moments in this film where her performance looks and feels painfully unbelievable. She seems more keen on getting off the set than she does being in the picture. Which, I mean, I don't blame her, but, you know, I assume it's a paid job at the end of the day, isn't it? The rest of the cast reek of TV acting for the most part, and whereas maybe a few eccentric performances here may have helped the overall viewing experience, this film has no such look. It's largely a dry affair, quite stiff in places, and even the bullies are comparatively a poor man's army of Biff Tannens. I just needed something from the supporting cast to make me think that there was some gold to be found here, and there just isn't. None of the extras are putting that much effort in, which is crucial at the end of the second act when the film falls back on our outcasts to help set up the faction wars. When the time comes for these guys to step up, they just don't, and it kind of deflated the motivation to see these outcasts get their comeuppance and overinflates a period of uncomfortable shuffling in my seat around David's explosive reaction. And yes, because the supporting cast can't be asked to be genuinely nasty in the final act, it makes David out to be an even bigger prat than the script wanted him to be. The OST is a mix of ballads and what sounds like every TV theme made in the 1970s and early 80s. I'd like to say it works, but it doesn't. I think a film like this could have stood to have a harder soundtrack, not strictly rock, but just something a bit darker in tone. But because instead they went for a lighter mix of wistful string arrangements and what sounds like a Neil Diamond knockoff singing the main theme for this film, You're at the Crossroads of Your Life, it feels a bit subdued and doesn't really help envelop me in the story. At best, it's ambivalent about the tone it wants to set, and at worst, the upbeat tones try to downplay the horrifying nature of David's operations. It also, again, only goes further to make the film feel like a TV production, so it's a big thumbs down from me. It seemed on paper like Massacre at Central High had a fairly straightforward release history. It appeared to be released in 1986 or 1987, I have conflicting reports, on VHS by Apex Films. It then sat in relative obscurity until 2004 when it was released as a bare-bones VHS dumped on DVD release by Cornerstone Media. That version's now out of print, but luckily in November 2020 the film received a full Blu-ray release by Synapse Films. Though I can't confirm if this version has been region-locked or not, so your mileage may vary. I had the original Apex release, and right away I noticed that something didn't quite sit right with the intro. There were a few flashes of frames in the first few seconds of my copy. So I slowed that section down, and sure enough, there are 3 frames that don't line up with the history I'm being presented with here. The first is a single frame of the logo for a distribution company, Merlin Video. The second is a frame of David running out of a school, and the third is a frame of an explosion. I've no idea how these frames snuck into the beginning of this film, nor why Merlin Video is shown briefly in the opening titles. The only reasoning I can find is that either Merlin had the distribution rights but lost them to Apex, who had to cut out the Merlin logo from the opening of the master they inherited, or Apex bought some X-tape stock from Merlin and my copy hasn't been blanked properly. Either way, apart from showing its age a bit in terms of rolling picture and the occasional tracking issue, the picture quality here is fine and the DVD release's PQ is only slightly better. I can't really comment on the quality of the Blu-ray remaster, but I think the bigger question would be who in their right mind would want to get this? Oh, also the VHS box art is terrifically misleading. That image on the box, literally nowhere to be seen in the movie. No one chops through a door with an axe, and there isn't a guy who looks like that in this film either. The only scene I can think this is referencing is a bit where Mark breaks out of a tool shed after David locks him and Teresa in. But even then, I don't think he uses an axe, and it's so blink and you'll miss it that making it the cover art seems ridiculous. In a world where school shootings are commonplace, terror is currently reigning over society, and fear is the meal of the day, the world doesn't need Massacre at Central High. While at the time of its release it may have served its purpose in titillation and a cheap thrill exploiting a tragedy which most people would never endure, time and events have changed that and rendered this film unpleasant to sit through in the 21st century. While I commend the direction and some of the Cine, the plot is just too close to home now and way too much on the killer's side for me to really even begin to contemplate recommending this one. It effectively glorifies murder and then tries to get you to sympathise with the killer, and I really can't condone that. What I will say, however, is despite this film being undefendable, it did sow the seeds of some good. The slasher elements within this film, in particular the hang glider and pool deaths, would go on to inspire up-and-coming filmmakers in the late 70s and early 80s in developing the slasher genre into the massive movement that it was throughout the 1980s. It can't be understated that some of the scenes depicted here really did help gestate those early slashers. And well, probably its biggest contribution to the world of arts is that it heavily inspired the plot of the 1989 cult classic Heathers. And watching this film, it's incredibly blatant just how influenced Heathers was by this. The only difference is that Massacre is a bit more serious, we follow the killer rather than the lead female protagonist here, and that the lead female protagonist is already in a relationship in Massacre, whereas she's single in Heathers. Otherwise, it's the same basic premise and same basic plot beats. The difference, however, is that Heathers reframes itself against the killer rather than in favour of him. We follow Winona Ryder's Veronica as she falls for Christian Slater's JD before quickly realising he's an out-and-out psychopath and doing everything she can to stop him. We never get that moment with David, and that reframing totally saves Heathers from becoming the poster child for school massacres, which Massacre at Central High seemingly doesn't seem to get, with its focus not on showing why David is wrong, but instead on his personal problems, with no real attempts being made to punish him when he does irredeemable things, which is especially damning considering he literally kills about a dozen people. It comes across more as an endorsement for just killing people to solve your problems rather than an indictment of the butcherings. Probably one I'll keep for reference. I won't be watching Massacre again anytime soon. Don't bother checking it out, there are way better films out there. It's pretty in places, but just really not worth your time.